Hello, welcome to another Wild Imagination video. I'm Alan, psychotherapist and author of Waking Dreams. I made a slideshow for something else I'm doing, a presentation. I thought I'd share it with my YouTube audience. Hello, YouTube, because it touches on and brings together a lot of the themes that I've been exploring on this channel. So without further ado, let me share the slides. Yeah, so I just want to touch on a couple of questions, key questions. What is imagination? And how can we imagine more fully? Because that's kind of what inspires me. It's like a lot of the ideas or assumptions that we have about imagination are not very helpful and indeed not very accurate. So if we can have better ideas about what imagination is, which is to say ideas aligned to the experience that match the phenomena, then on the basis of that understanding of what imagination is experientially, we can then cultivate the principles and skills needed to imagine more fully. And as we know from other videos, an imaginative life is a healing and transformative and creative life. So let's get into it. What is imagination? So here is an image. No point doing a presentation on imagination without images. So it's a painting by Van Gogh, the bedroom. What happens as we look at the painting? In other words, what goes on as we imagine into the painting? I'll tell you what happens for me, which might be different, but I would imagine that the generic principles are the same. The first thing is that I imagine a place, a three-dimensional place, a room, a bedroom. I don't see the brush strokes particularly. I certainly don't see pixels on a digital screen. On a flat screen, I see a three-dimensional place. Second thing that happens for me is it's like the imagination creates a story about this place, and a story has a temporal dimension, a beginning, middle, and end. So I've imagined that someone's got up. I'm thinking about the person who lives in the room. They've made the bed and they've left the room for now, for whatever reason. Maybe they'll come back. And then thirdly, and lastly, connected to the second point, which is that I've animated the screen. I mean, the screen's inert. It's ostensibly dead. But the storying of the painting has turned it into a living presence. The person in the room hasn't even been represented in the painting, but I've brought, I can't but not bring personhood into the painting. So the flat paintings become a 3D space, the static paintings become a temporal situation, and the inert painting has become a living presence. Quote there from David Abraham: imagination is the way the senses throw themselves beyond what is immediately given. So as I said, I've not seen pixels. That's what actually my senses receive. Imagination takes that raw data and then fills in the gaps between the pixels, and also fills in the gaps between the brush strokes, and creates a story. So in this broad sense, imagination is connected to perception. So Philip Pullman, he writes, you won't understand anything about imagination until you realize that it's not about making things up, it's about perception. So in this broader sense, how we perceive people, places, and things is an ongoing act of imagination that there's no getting away from in everyday life. So it's not just paintings. When you leave the art gallery and walk down the street and look at the people and the sky, it's imagination that helps you make sense, that creates a story about who you are and your place in the world. So a couple of definitions along these lines, one from Stephen Levine, one from me. Stephen says, imagination can be said to be the bridge between self and world. We are always on this bridge. And my definition from my book, imagination is the perception of images arising in between self and world. So between me and the painting, an image arises, and the image is neither entirely in me, subjective, because I've had to attend to the object, the screen, or the actual painting, but neither is it an objective thing, because that's just brush strokes on a flat surface. The image that I have arises between self and world, subject and object. And we can pause here, because this broad understanding of imagination, which we've built up from the actual experience, is way different from the quite limited definition that you get often in the literature and in dictionaries of imagination being somehow pictures inside the mind, or images, mental images not present to the senses. We'll come back to that later. So principles and skills of imaginative life. So I've got 3 principles and associated skills that will help you enhance this imaginative interplay between self and world. What we're doing here then is looking at the painting, as it were, imagining, as opposed to reading the blurb about the painting, as it were. What we are wanting to do is distinguish between imagining and thinking about images. Often when we go to the art gallery, we can't but not, it's so tempting to read the blurb and look for our understanding there. And that's fine and that's interesting, but it's not imagining per se. So let's look at 3 principles and the skills that go alongside them that will help you to enhance imaginative life. First principle, images are places. They are not static 2-dimensional photographs. They are places. Whenever we're imagining, we're in a place. So the skill here is to enter and explore from within the image as an encompassing sensory environment. How you do that is attend not just to the visual images, but to all the senses. So the sounds that you imagine, the smells that you imagine, the tastes and the textures that you imagine, the temperature that you imagine, quality of the light that you perceive and you imagine when you're in this image place. Whether that's looking at a painting, reading a novel and being taken into a fictional world, whether that's watching a movie and being taken into and transported into the imagescape of the movie world, or indeed in everyday life, walking down the street. Attend to your senses. And indeed, the more you attend to your senses in the everyday world, the more embodied you are, the more imaginative you will be when you read the novel, when you look at the painting. Also, as well as senses, look at the distances, the spaces. How large is the room that I'm in? How high is the ceiling above me? Are there any movements outside the window? Look to your left, look to your right. Don't be stuck with a static point of view. Turn through 360 degrees and include your feelings and thoughts that emerge in response to this environment. So got a riff here of Little Red Riding Hood, and she says, "I'm not happy someone's sleeping in my bed, but I wonder who it is." So you have a thought about the image environment, and you have a feeling about it. Bringing that together with your sensory impressions will help you inhabit the image as a place. Principle number 2, imagination is a process. It is a journey. Don't rush to get somewhere, because then you'll lose the conditions needed to inhabit the imaginative journey. So some of the skills to help you inhabit this process: a synthesis of sensation, feeling, and thinking. We want a nice balance of these 3 faculties, if you like. If thinking gets overemphasized, we lose the imaginative process. We turn the images into ideas. We end up stepping back and outside the process and looking at the images as content to be analyzed. Feelings can sometimes overwhelm us, and that can take us out of the process. But whether it's feeling or thinking that's getting turned up, we can balance it out by attending and continuing to attend to the sensory impressions, the sights and sounds and tastes and smells of the image environment. Particularly, we will do that sensory work by looking out for and noticing small, quirky, and specific details. Okay, so you're standing on a floor. What kind of floor is it? It's a wooden floor. What kind of grain does it have? How old is the floor? How dirty is the floor? There's a towel hanging behind the doorway. What is it hanging on? Oh, a rusty nail. The wall is plasterboard. What kind of plasterboard? What color? Is it flat? Is there textures? Is there cracks in the plasterboard? Get into the details, and that will hold you in the imaginative process. And as you gather the details, you're gathering together the whole image. Don't get stuck on just one part of it, because that'll turn it into a photograph. You want to maintain the sense of being in a place by having a dynamic description of the whole. And do this slowly. You need to slow down in order to take in the fine-grained details that you need to inhabit the imaginative process. To the extent that we speed up, we tend to move into abstraction and generalization, and that bounces us out. And also look out for the spontaneous and the emergent. Anything that's unexpected. I mean, be prepared to be surprised, if you like. Usually imagination throws surprises in, and that keeps us in the imagination process rather than getting bored or indifferent or generic. And thirdly and lastly, principle 3, images as images. Approach images on their own level as images, which sounds a bit strange and maybe a bit obvious, but in our culture, imagination is often given a secondary importance. And really what we're interested in doing is working out what the image represents. So the image is like a stand-in or a symbol for something else. The meaning is found in the feeling or the idea or the real world event that the image is just a stand-in for. And again, what that does is, as we've mentioned, that trips you out of the process and pushes you into thinking about what the images represent or coming up with interpretations. What we're looking for is the meaningfulness within the imaginative experience, rather than figuring out what it means. As will happen when you go to the movies and it's a good movie and you come away feeling a bit better, a bit less depressed than when you went in, you've been moved by the language of images. You don't really know why the movie has touched you in the way it has, but you've been transported into other worlds, other ways of being. You've been taken out of yourself through the language of images, not because you've figured out your depression. So we do that by avoiding any kind of abstract terms from psychotherapy speak. So if you meet a child in imagination, it's a child. Don't think about it as your inner child or your child part, because that's a cognitive distance that comes in as soon as you start to do that. In the same way as might happen as when you went to the movies and you had a little light pen, you're a movie critic, and you're writing down the influences that you see in the movie and the genre mashup that the directors created. So you've got lots of ideas about the movie, but you've not been touched by it. You've not allowed yourself to be moved by the images because you're thinking about them all the time, analyzing them. So just get into an up close and intimate relationship to the imagery. You want to be, as it were, on safari in imagination, which is to say not to have a cognitive separation. You don't want to go on a zoo trip where the images are held back behind bars or viewed through the glass of ideas, filtered and reduced into what they represent. Okay, so there you go. What is imagination? It's an in-between world. It's a liminal space between self and world, between you and the world. And we can enhance that in three ways: by recognizing that images are places, imagination is a process, and approaching the images as images on their own level. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful, and you can now go off and get interested in imagination and living a more imaginative life. Thanks for watching to the end. If you're new, do subscribe. And if you'd like to learn more about wild imagination, do check out my book, Waking Dreams, Imagination in Psychotherapy and Everyday Life. And I will see you again in the next video. Okay, bye-bye.